Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. For last year, December, I was asked to teach a week in Norway that included the book of Ezra. This offered me a rare opportunity. I don't think I've ever taught this book before, so it gave me the chance to prepare a brand new teaching on a book from scratch. Some months before, I did an issue on narrative criticism, and I decided to use this tool in preparing for class. So I now present the results of a very simple narrative critical analysis. My aim was to learn more about the author's or the editor's point of view by paying attention to interpretation and comments by the narrator, actions and utterances by participants, and repetitions. It is likely that Ezra and Nehemiah were originally one book. It is certainly treated this way in the Jewish Bible, and it wasn't until the 3rd century AD that the book was first split into two. Although I focused on the book of Ezra, I did therefore pay some attention to its continuation in Nehemiah as well. Obviously, Ezra Nehemiah has been composed using a number of sources: a memoir of Ezra, a memoir of Nehemiah, both memoirs written in the I form, a rarity in the Hebrew Bible, various lists, and several official letters and edicts involving Persian kings. Some of the letters are in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, the official language of the empire and the language of international communication. Finally, before I turn to the narrative analysis, it should be noticed that the events of Ezra 1 through 6 considerably predate the rest of the book. Here you see a list of the kings of Persia that are mentioned in the book of Ezra with the years of their reigns: Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes. Now, Xerxes is only mentioned once, briefly, and in Ezra is therefore not very important. He is the king in the book of Esther. But otherwise, for the most part, in Ezra 1 through 6, Cyrus and Darius are important. This is about events that took place immediately after the exile. And these chapters cover the years 539, the Edict of Cyrus, until 516, when the temple was completed. According to Ezra 7, verse 8, Ezra returned to Jerusalem in the 7th year of King Artaxerxes, which is 458, approximately 80 years after the first group of Jews returned to Jerusalem. Nehemiah followed in the 20th year of Artaxerxes, so that is approximately the year 445. Interestingly, Ezra reappears in the book of Nehemiah in chapters 8 and 12. So Ezra and Nehemiah were contemporaries, and their ministries partially overlapped, but they were not contemporaries of Joshua and Zerubbabel in Ezra 1 through 6. One peculiarity is that part of the material in Ezra chapter 4 is a correspondence with Artaxerxes and is out of place chronologically. It relates to the rebuilding of the city, not of the temple, and it may well be the background for Nehemiah, where it is about rebuilding the city wall. And presumably it is placed in Ezra 4, not chronologically, but because the subject is opposition. It is not part of the time period covered in the rest of Ezra chapter 1 through 6. So first, comments and interpretation given by the narrator. I'm using Locals Bible software here, looking at the text of Ezra. And the first thing that stood out to me is that the account in Ezra is remarkably matter-of-fact. It recounts what happened and only rarely gives a comment or an interpretation. This means we have to dig deeper to discover the author's point of view, his standard of evaluation that leads us to the intended message of the book. The book does give us a few interpretations, that Cyrus permits the Jews to return and that there are those who respond is because, in orange, the Lord stirred up their spirit. And the narrator discovers behind this also the intent of God, namely that the word of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. Several chapters later, when the people of the land first appear in the text, they're immediately introduced to us on first appearance as the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin. When the Jews restart their attempt to rebuild the temple after a break in chapter 4, we find that they can do so because the eye of their God was on them. And they managed to complete it in chapter 6 because the Lord had turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them so that he aided them in the work of the house of God. When Ezra enters onto the scene, we learn several times that the hand of the Lord his God was on him and on those who are with him. We also learn from the narrator what Ezra's intent was and what skills he brought with him. Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to do it and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. Whenever the law is mentioned, it is often made explicit that either Moses or God or both are its source. It is never the law of Israel, it is the law of God and of Moses. There is more, but it is not much. It is sufficient, however, to establish that God is with them in this endeavor of return and rebuilding, and that the law is of central importance to this book. Next is indirect evaluation through what people say and do, and we learn a bit more through the words and actions of those who appear in the narrative. In Ezra 3, for instance, the people gather as one man in Jerusalem, rebuild the altar, celebrate the Feast of Booths. Shortly after, they begin with rebuilding the temple. The laying of the foundation leads to celebration, praise, and great joy, but also grief. This section describing the initial return and rebuilding of the temple finishes with a celebration of the Passover. Through all of this, we see more clearly what is central and important in the outlook of Ezra and its author. Obviously, this includes the temple and its cult. We also gain an impression of a community that is serious about following God's Torah. We get to know the adversaries in Ezra 5 through their actions as well, especially through the letter included in Ezra 4, verse 7 through 16, a letter that is full of slander, flattery, and spin. When it is answered, they go, so Ezra 4:23, in haste to Jerusalem and force a stop to the work that's going on there. It's worth noting, however, that none of the edicts and letters by the Persian kings throw any negative light on them, not even the answer by Artaxerxes in Ezra 4, verse 17 and following, to this slanderous letter. True, Artaxerxes orders a halt to the rebuilding of Jerusalem, not of the temple. Remember, this part is chronologically out of place. But the king has good reasons, and it is only, so 4:21, until a decree is made by me. Everywhere else, the kings of Persia give their full support. There's also a clear contrast to the slanderous letter in the second letter written by Persian officials in Ezra 5, verse 6 and following. This one is much more positive or restrained. As a result, the temple is finished by decree of the God of Israel, and by decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia. This establishes that God is giving the people favor with the worldly powers and that these support the restoration that is taking place. At least one more value point is communicated indirectly in the concluding chapters of Ezra. After these things had been done, the officials approached me and said, "The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with their abominations, for they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons." As soon as I, that is Ezra, heard this, I tore my garment and my cloak, pulled hair from my head and bared and sat appalled. The importance of this is shown by the fact that the officials consider it necessary to inform Ezra, and by Ezra's strong emotional reaction, and also by the amount of space given to the issue. I will have more to say about this in the next section. I now move on to repetitions, and they provide the richest insight into the purpose of this book. The repetition that is most frequent is that of the house of God. It appears right from the start in the edict by King Cyrus, mentioned 3 times in 3 verses. Rebuilding this house is the explicit purpose of those who return. Cyrus lets them take the vessels of the house of the Lord with them. All in all, there are almost 50 references to the house of God in the book of Ezra, and that's not counting any occurrences of the word temple. It's less common in Nehemiah, especially in the first 9 chapters. This is not surprising, considering Nehemiah is primarily about rebuilding the wall around Jerusalem. Nevertheless, in the final 4 chapters of Nehemiah, there are still 14 references to the house of God. This alone suffices to establish the temple as the number 1 thing on the mind of the author. But there is more. Next in importance and in the sequence of the text is the law of God. It is first mentioned in chapter 3 in connection with the sacrifices and feasts. At that point, the altar is restored, even though the rest of the house is still in ruins. The law becomes the main subject beginning in chapter 7, not surprisingly, with the return of Ezra the scribe. In these later chapters, too, the focus is on laws dealing with the cult in the house of the Lord, not with what we might call individual ethics. There is a strong interest in priests and Levites and other functions directly related to the house throughout Ezra and Nehemiah. We find the same focus in the covenant that the people make in Nehemiah 10. It's mostly about provisions for the service in the house of God. There are 2 additional central themes in Ezra and Nehemiah. One is that of the wall that Nehemiah built. The other is that of separation and intermarriage. This subject takes center stage both at the end of Ezra and at the end of Nehemiah. This suggests the author considers it of the utmost importance. It is perhaps his number 1 application for the original readers. The subject of separation first appears positively in the context of the Passover. Ezra 6, it was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by everyone who had joined them and separated himself from the uncleanness of the peoples of the land to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. And notice the connection with ritual purity here, and later. Race or ethnicity is not the issue. In chapter 9, it turns out that the people of Israel, including priests and Levites, Ezra 9 verse 1, have not separated themselves from the peoples of the land, but have intermarried with them. The final 2 chapters of Ezra are entirely about this problem. It is interesting to note the order of these major subjects. First the house, then the law, and the wall only third. I doubt we would have chosen this order. It looks eminently impractical, and yet it is precisely right. As I mentioned, the problem of separation and intermarriage comes up again toward the end of Nehemiah. In Nehemiah 9 verse 2, it says that the Israelites separated themselves from all foreigners, also in chapter 13. And then in chapter 10, Nehemiah 10, it is all who have separated themselves from the peoples of the land to the law of God who enter into a covenant with God. And yet, in Nehemiah 13, intermarriage with foreign women is still an ongoing problem. Based on this, it appears that the two books have a parallel structure. Ezra and Nehemiah, building the house, building the wall. Opposition, the law, Ezra comes, Ezra reads, separation and intermarriage. In addition, the Feast of Booths is celebrated twice, once in each book. Each book refers to the reorganization of the Levites and the temple service by David. The list of those who returned in the days of Cyrus is included twice as well, Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7. Now, not everything in these books is repeated, and not all repetition is in the same order, but there is enough that it appears intentional. What emerges is a normative vision for those who have returned from exile. This connects the emphasis on the house of God with the law, especially its cultic commandments, with the importance of separation. Separation, after all, is all about cleanness and ritual purity. It is essential to the proper restoration of the service of the house of God. And of worship in the midst of a community walking with God. The lists fit in here as well. They document who belongs to this people of God and who are legitimate priests and Levites. The wall around Jerusalem is needed to protect and defend this renewed community of God's people and to reinforce separation. For instance, it makes a stricter Sabbath observance possible in Nehemiah 13. Wherever emotion comes out in these two books, and Nehemiah has plenty of it, its aim is to strengthen devotion and zeal for God's law and the service of his house. Together, all of this serves to regain and guarantee continuity with the past in life and worship for the sake of the future. In other words, these themes, house, law, sacrificial cult, festivals, separation, Jerusalem, are to be the orientating center of those who have returned. It provides them with a normative vision for life. I leave it up to you to contemplate the next step in this study. What implications does this have for life in the New Covenant community? What does not carry over, at least not in a straightforward manner, but needs redefinition? What does separation mean in our context? And especially, how does Ezra Nehemiah speak encouragement to a New Testament believer?
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience.